The Titans' Den Arena in Nashville wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. You had to know somebody, or know somebody who knew somebody. It was tucked away under an old warehouse near the river, hidden behind rusted steel doors and a blinking neon sign that simply read, Den. Inside it was like stepping into another world, a world of sweat, smoke, and steel where fists settled scores and every scream from the crowd carried a weight of its own. The air was thick, humming with the raw energy of people hungry for blood and glory. The arena floor was a pit surrounded by rising stands packed tight with bodies. Fans shouted over each other, waving their drinks and slapping hands against the metal railings. The lights above flashed harsh and fast, spinning in sharp colors that carved across the smoke-filled air. Somewhere in the distance, a bell clanged, and the noise surged louder. The Titans' Den didn't believe in rules or polish. It was about heart heat and high-stakes combat. Every fight had a price, and every fighter knew it. Tonight was bigger than most. Word had spread weeks in advance. Jack Maddox, better known by his fight name Python, was headlining. And wherever Python went, chaos followed. He wasn't the best fighter in the world, but he was the loudest, the flashiest, and by far the most hated. He had built his entire reputation on playing the villain, mocking his opponents, stirring up fans, and loving every second of it. The lights dimmed, and a thumping bass filled the air. The crowd roared, already on edge. Smoke poured from the entrance tunnel as Python's theme music blasted through the speakers heavy and fast, a pounding track with sirens and snarling guitars. Then he appeared, arms stretched wide, his body gleaming under the strobes. He wore a black robe with a bright green snake coiled around the back, and his trademark grin lit up his face. He strutted down the aisle like he owned every square inch of that place. People booed, others cheered just to be part of the madness. Python soaked it in, laughing, pointing at fans blowing mock kisses to the front rows. He moved like a man who knew exactly how far he could push it, and didn't care one bit. When he reached the cage, he threw off his robe and flexed, showing off a body carved from years of brutal training. He grabbed the microphone from the announcer with a swagger that made the crowd howl. He didn't speak yet, though. He just smiled, letting the moment build, letting the tension stretch. He knew how to work a crowd, and tonight he was going to milk every second. But before he could start, the lights shifted again. The music cut off, replaced by a solemn drum roll. The crowd hushed, not completely silent, but close enough. The announcer's voice echoed out steady and respectful. Tonight, he said, before the main event, the Titans' Den would honor veterans from all branches of service. A small gesture, but a powerful one, even in a place like this. One by one, names were called, and faces appeared on the giant screens above the cage. Older men and women were standing proudly in the crowd, some with medals pinned to their chests, and others simply nodded with quiet dignity. The audience clapped a different kind of applause this time, more grounded and sincere. This was a moment beyond the chaos. Then the camera landed on a face that sparked a different kind of stir. Chuck Norris. He sat near the front row with silver hair and a lined face, his eyes calm but sharp as ever. He wore a simple black jacket, nothing flashy, but his presence alone carried weight. Beside him sat his granddaughter Megan, a young woman in her early 20s, with striking features and a protective gaze that never drifted far from him. The crowd reacted with a mix of surprise and excitement. Some shouted his name, others simply stared. Chuck didn't wave or smile. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the moment but not drawing it out. He was no stranger to attention, but he didn't chase it either. Python saw it too, and something in his eyes shifted. He raised the microphone, and his grin grew wider, sharper. "Well, would you look at that?" he drawled, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "The legend himself, Chuck Norris." A ripple ran through the crowd, half laughter, half curiosity. Python kept going, pacing slowly around the cage, his gaze locked on Chuck. "Man, I used to watch your movies when I was a kid." He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. You know, back when action heroes didn't need stunt doubles because everything was so slow. A few scattered laughs broke out. Python latched onto them, tightening his grip. "I gotta ask," he continued, leaning forward against the cage, shouting loud enough for everyone to hear. "How's retirement treating you? Chuck bones still holding up? Or do they creak every time you get out of that rocking chair?" The laughter grew louder now, but so did the unease. People weren't sure whether to enjoy it or look away. Chuck didn't move. His expression didn't change. Megan's jaw tightened, but she stayed seated, her hand resting gently on his arm. Python smelled blood. He wasn't done. He strutted back to the center of the cage, pointing straight at Chuck. "You know I gotta thank you, old man. Without you paving the way, guys like me wouldn't have a career. But let's be real, you're a museum piece, a relic. A dusty old VHS tape nobody watches anymore." The arena shifted. Some were laughing, but others were quiet now, watching with narrowed eyes. Even in this place, there were lines you didn't cross lightly. Python didn't care. He walked back to the microphone stand, picked it up again, and shouted loud enough to shake the walls. "In fact, why don't we settle it right now?" He pointed at Chuck, his voice cutting through the building like a blade. "Come on, hero. One last fight, you and me. Right here, right now." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. The crowd froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the lights seemed to dim, as if the whole place was holding its breath. Chuck sat still, his face unreadable. His eyes locked on Python with quiet intensity. Python raised both hands in mock shock. "Oh, what's the matter?" he taunted, dragging out the words. "Too scared or too old?" It broke the silence. Gasps and whispers spread like wildfire through the arena. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Python grinned wider, sensing the storm he had unleashed. The tribute to veterans had turned into something else entirely. It wasn't a show anymore. It wasn't scripted. It was personal. And every person in that building could feel it. They were no longer watching a fight. They were witnessing the start of something they wouldn't forget. Chuck didn't flinch. He sat there steady as stone, letting the noise swirl around him like wind through an old oak. His hands rested calmly on his knees. Fingers interlaced, his eyes fixed on the cage with the patience of a man who had seen storms come and go. He didn't blink at Python's words. He didn't move a muscle. He had nothing to prove, and that was what made his stillness feel even heavier. Megan leaned in close, her voice tight with worry, trying to urge him to leave it alone. Her hand gripped his arm, her knuckles white against his jacket sleeve. She could see the sparks beginning to fly. Around them, feel the weight of every eye in the arena settling on her grandfather. She knew what this place thrived on. She knew how quickly it could spin out of control. But Chuck didn't move. He sat through the storm, letting it wash over him. Python wasn't satisfied with silence. He wanted a show, and he was going to get it one way or another. He prowled around the cage, dragging out his words, his voice loud and cutting through the thick air. He jabbed at Chuck's age again, mocking the wrinkles, the silver hair, the slower steps. He called him the ghost of an action hero, nothing more than a dusty trophy hauled out for pity applause. The crowd shifted uneasy now. Some fans still laughed, but others were growing uncomfortable, stealing glances toward Chuck as if expecting something to break. But Python wasn't done. He turned toward Megan, his grin sharp as a knife, and the air dropped several degrees colder. He laughed and said he heard about Megan's military service, twisting it into a cheap joke. He mocked her, too, making snide remarks about her rank, her medals, even her dedication to her family name. He called her a charity case, riding her grandfather's fading fame. His words slithered through the arena, cruel and pointed, and every syllable felt like it scraped against the walls. That was the moment everything changed. The laughter died instantly. The audience sat stiff and still, the tension thick enough to choke on. People weren't watching a show anymore. They were watching a man cross a line no one had dared to before. Megan's face flushed with fury, her eyes burning, but Chuck remained motionless. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look away. He just stared at Python, calm and steady, letting the weight of that stare settle over every person in that arena. And then, slowly, Chuck's hands unclasped. He placed them firmly on the arms of his chair and rose. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if the very act of standing was meant to shake the walls. His back straightened, his shoulders squared, and for the first time all night he let his presence fill the room. The arena fell into absolute silence. Not a breath, not a whisper. Just the quiet sound of Chuck Norris standing up. Python's grin faltered just a flicker, but enough for anyone watching closely to notice. Chuck stood there towering in his own quiet way, his gaze never leaving the man in the cage. He let the silence stretch, holding it like a man who knew the exact moment to strike. And then, without raising his voice, without any hint of anger, he spoke. 5 words. Let me show you why. His voice was low, steady, but it carried through the building like a shot fired in the dark. The words hung there heavy and unshakable, cutting through every layer of noise that had come before. The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People rose to their feet without even realizing it, their eyes wide, their hands covering their mouths. The shift in the air was electric, the kind of moment that felt too big to fit inside 4 walls. Megan's eyes widened in shock, her breath catching in her throat. She reached for Chuck, but he gently placed his hand over hers, steadying her, letting her know this wasn't something she could stop. He took a step forward, then another, moving, with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove but everything left to teach. The crowd parted for him, creating a path without even thinking. Nobody dared stand in his way. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something deeper. Respect, reverence, a collective understanding that they were about to witness something they would talk about for the rest of their lives. Python's grin had vanished now, replaced by something closer to confusion, maybe even doubt. He watched as Chuck moved toward the cage. Every step carrying the weight of 1,000 memories, 1,000 victories, 1,000 lessons carved into muscle and bone. Chuck reached the edge of the cage, his eyes locked on Python, and the announcer didn't even try to stop him. Nobody did. They all stood frozen, caught in the pull of something far bigger than themselves. The security guards looked at each other, unsure whether to intervene, but one by one they stepped aside. Chuck reached the steps of the cage and paused for a moment as if measuring the distance. Then he climbed each step steady and sure, until he stood at the entrance facing Python with the calm of a man who had already won. The energy in the arena was no longer chaotic. It was focused, sharp humming with anticipation so thick it made the air hard to breathe. Chuck didn't say another word. He simply stepped inside his boots, hitting the mat with a quiet finality that sent chills through every person watching. Python backed away slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. He lifted the microphone again, his voice a little less steady now, trying to salvage the bravado. He muttered something about old men making mistakes, but his words didn't carry the same bite. The crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. All eyes were on Chuck. Megan watched from her seat, her heart pounding in her chest, torn between fear and awe. She had seen her grandfather's quiet strength all her life. But this was different. This was the kind of strength that didn't need to shout or swing fists to shake the earth beneath it. Chuck stood in the center of the cage, his hands at his sides, calm and ready. The referee, still stunned by the unfolding scene, hesitated before stepping forward. The announcer's voice cracked through the speakers, stumbling over the words as he tried to catch up with reality. The crowd leaned in holding their breath, waiting for the moment the bell would ring. And through it all, Chuck never looked away from Python. He didn't need to. The message had already been sent. Tonight wasn't about age. It wasn't about past glory. It was about respect. And every person in that arena understood it now. The legend had risen, and the night was far from over. Chuck stepped fully into the cage, and the sound of that door closing behind him rang louder than the crowd itself. It wasn't slammed. It wasn't forced. It simply clicked shut, calm and final, like a chapter turning in a thick old book. That soft clank seemed to pull every eye in the arena back toward him. He moved with the ease of a man who had been here before more times than anyone could count. No wasted steps, no quick glances, no posturing. He walked to the center of the cage, standing still as the bright lights poured down on him, his face steady and unreadable. The crowd stayed quiet, not because they were asked, but because something about this moment demanded it. It was that kind of silence people only hear in churches or at gravesides. They all seemed to know somehow that they were standing in the presence of something bigger than just a fight. Python kept circling, pacing like a caged animal, his voice filling the void with nervous energy. He kept tossing out words, trying to fill the room with noise. He jeered about old joints called Chuck. A walking antique tossed out cheap shots about retirement homes and broken hips. But nobody was laughing anymore. The more Python spoke, the smaller his words seemed to get, like they were swallowed by something too large to fight against. He pushed harder, louder, angrier, but every word seemed to bounce off the quiet wall that Chuck had built just by standing there. Chuck didn't even glance at him. He simply stood breathing slowly and steadily, his hands loose at his sides, and his posture was easy but strong. His eyes never wandered from where they needed to be. He wasn't looking for cameras or the crowd or even the referee. He was looking at Python and nowhere else. That was what made it unsettling. Python was used to noise, to shouting matches, to people biting back. He thrived on it. But this was something else, something colder. Chuck's calm wasn't an act. It wasn't showmanship. It was real, and it seeped into the air like a quiet storm rolling in over the hills. Megan watched from her seat, her heart thudding hard in her chest. But even she could see it now. This wasn't the same man who had walked in as her grandfather. Something had shifted. The lone wolf had returned, and every soul in that building felt it, even if they didn't know exactly why. The referee, still caught between duty and disbelief, hesitated before stepping forward. He asked a question, but Chuck didn't need to answer. He gave a single calm nod, and that was enough. Python's voice wavered for the first time, a crack slipping through his grin as he barked out one more insult, daring Chuck to take the first shot. But Chuck didn't move. He just watched, waiting, letting Python burn himself out on empty noise. People leaned in from the stands, unable to look away. They weren't watching for fists anymore. They were watching for something deeper. A moment. A spark. Something they would tell stories about for the rest of their lives. Chuck took one slow step forward. It wasn't fast. It wasn't flashy. But it carried more weight than any punch thrown that night. Python instinctively backed up his body, betraying him before his brain caught up. He tried to cover it with another laugh, but the damage was done. The audience saw it. He had flinched. Chuck kept walking, calm and sure, never breaking his rhythm. It was like watching a wave roll in, steady and inevitable. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't need to. The silence grew thicker with every step. Somewhere in the crowd, someone muttered under their breath, barely loud enough to hear, "He's not here to fight. He's here to end it." That was when it hit. Every person in that building realized it at once. Chuck wasn't there for pride or payback, or even to answer an insult. He was there to remind them all who he was, who he had always been. And in that moment, all the lights, all the noise, all the years fell away. There was only the lone wolf standing in the cage ready to reclaim his ground. The air felt heavy with it, and the night was holding its breath, waiting for the first strike. The bell rang sharp and cold, cutting through the thick silence like a blade. Python sprang forward at once, fast and loud, throwing a wild punch that sliced through the air just inches from Chuck's face. He grinned widely, shouting to the crowd feeding on their noise as he threw another shot, this one spinning high meant to show off. Chuck didn't flinch. He shifted just enough for the strike to miss, not by luck, but by quiet design. His feet barely moved, but his body flowed around the punch like water sliding past a stone. Python's grin stretched wider, mistaking the dodge for hesitation. He kept coming, throwing sharper strikes, quick jabs, followed by spinning kicks all laced with swagger. He taunted with every swing, laughing loud, barking out words meant to rile up the crowd. But no matter how fast he moved, no matter how loud he got, none of it touched Chuck. Chuck moved like a shadow always there, yet impossible to grasp. He didn't block, he didn't strike back, he simply wasn't where the punches landed. The crowd started to notice. At first, they laughed along with Python cheering every swing, every flash of movement. But as the misses piled up, their cheers grew softer, replaced by murmurs and glances exchanged between seats. It wasn't just that Python was missing, it was how easy Chuck made it look. Python's breath started to catch just barely, but it was there. His strikes came faster, now sharper, more desperate, trying to force something to happen. He swept low, aimed high, twisted his body for dramatic effect, but Chuck kept slipping just beyond reach. There was no wasted motion in Chuck's steps, no panic, no rush. He moved with a calm so steady it pulled the room tighter with every passing second. The cage, once filled with noise and bravado, now felt like it was shrinking around Python. He lashed out again, a hard left meant to catch Chuck off guard. But Chuck turned with it, letting the punch graze his eyes, never leaving Python's face. That look unsettled him more than the missed strike. Python's grin started to crack the corners of his mouth, twitching as confusion seeped in. He backed off for a moment, circling, breathing harder than before, sweat starting to shine on his forehead under the lights. Chuck stood still again, relaxed, steady on his feet, as if waiting for a breeze. The crowd leaned in, drawn deeper by the strange rhythm unfolding in front of them. They weren't watching a brawl anymore. They were watching something else entirely. A dance, slow and deliberate, with one man leading and the other stumbling behind. Python couldn't stand it. He charged, swinging hard with everything he had, shouting again to mask the rising panic in his chest. He aimed high-low wherever he could, his arms a blur of motion. But every strike passed through empty space as if Chuck had vanished before he arrived. Chuck's movements weren't flashy. He didn't dodge in big, dramatic ways. He moved just enough, always staying one step outside of danger, letting Python wear himself down inch by inch. The crowd began to shift. They started to cheer again, but this time it wasn't for Python. It was for the quiet mastery unfolding right in front of them. They saw it now, clear as day. Chuck wasn't surviving. He wasn't escaping. He was controlling everything. Python's face flushed red, his breathing loud enough to hear between each strike. He kept swinging, but every miss dragged him deeper into frustration. His taunts turned sharp, bitter, desperate. Chuck stayed silent. He didn't need words. Every step, every turn, every slight lean spoke louder than anything Python could shout. People in the crowd started chanting softly, voices rising in small waves of awe and respect. They saw the truth now. This wasn't luck. This wasn't hesitation. This was precision. This was patience. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Python stumbled after another wild swing, his balance slipping as his feet tangled from his own speed. He caught himself, but barely, and the crowd roared not at him, but at the sight of the shift. Chuck hadn't even touched him yet, but somehow he was winning. The tension in the air grew sharper with every second. Nobody knew when the strike would come, but everyone knew it was close. They could feel it waiting just beneath the surface, ready to break. And in the middle of it all, Chuck stood calm, steady as ever, ready to end the dance whenever he chose. Python's steps were growing heavier, dragging just slightly with every failed strike. His chest rose and fell in quick, ragged bursts as he circled, still swinging wild but slower now. Sweat dripped down his face, and the sharp gleam in his eyes was starting to dull beneath the weight of frustration and exhaustion. Chuck waited. He didn't chase, didn't flinch, didn't even raise his hands. He simply watched, steady and patient. His focus locked in like a hawk circling high above. The tension in the room had settled into something sharper, something taut and ready to snap. Python lunged again, a last-ditch strike sloppy and wide. That was the moment Chuck had been waiting for. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. Chuck moved with sudden, blinding speed, his body a blur as he stepped inside Python's reach. There was no wasted motion, no wind-up, no warning. His fist shot forward, a quick jab that landed clean on Python's jaw, snapping his head back. The crowd gasped as one. Before Python could even stumble, Chuck struck again. A sharp, precise hook to the ribs, the kind that stole the air right out of a man's lungs. Python's knees buckled, his mouth falling open in shock, but Chuck wasn't finished. He pivoted, turning his hips with perfect balance, and unleashed a final strike, a straight right hand, calm and fast crashing square into Python's chin. The sound echoed through the arena, loud and sharp like a crack of thunder. Python's body folded before anyone could react. He dropped instantly, crumpling to the mat with no chance to catch himself. One moment he was standing wild and cocky. The next he was down motionless, the fight drained from his limbs. Silence filled the air for a brief, breathless second. Then the arena erupted. The crowd exploded their cheers, crashing down like a wave roaring through every corner of the building. People jumped to their feet, shouting and clapping, unable to contain the rush of adrenaline and disbelief. Chuck stood over Python, calm and steady, his hands still low as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. He didn't gloat, he didn't gesture, he simply looked down for a quiet second, then turned away. The referee rushed in, checking on Python, who remained flat on the mat, dazed and broken by the storm that had hit him. Chuck walked back toward the edge of the cage, moving with the same quiet confidence he had carried since the start. His breathing was steady, his face calm, untouched by the chaos swirling around him. Megan stood in the crowd, her eyes wide with shock, one hand covering her mouth. She had seen her grandfather fight before years ago, but this wasn't the man she remembered from old stories or home videos. This was something else entirely. The entire arena had seen it now. The difference between skill and showmanship, between noise and mastery, between a fighter and a legend. People kept cheering their voices, shaking the walls, some still too stunned to speak. Chuck didn't bask in it. He reached the cage door, nodded once to the referee, then stepped out without a word, leaving the stunned silence behind him. The crowd parted for him again, this time with something deeper than respect. It was awe. He had walked into the fire, stayed calm in the storm, and walked out untouched. As Chuck disappeared into the shadows beyond the cage, the chant began to rise. Soft at first, then louder. Lone wolf, lone wolf. It rolled through the stands, steady and strong, carrying with it the weight of what they had all witnessed. Inside the cage, Python finally stirred, dazed and confused, looking around as if waking from a nightmare. But the night no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man who had ended the fight with nothing more than precision patience and a flash of thunder. The cage still hummed with the weight of what had just happened. The crowd's roar had faded to an uneasy hush, leaving only the sound of heavy breaths and quiet footsteps echoing through the space. Chuck didn't rush. He moved with the same calm he had carried all night, steady and deliberate, as he walked back toward the man still lying on the mat. Python remained on the ground, dazed and lost, staring up at the bright lights above. His chest rose and fell hard. His face flushed with defeat, his eyes wide and unsure. He had been loud, fierce, and full of fire only minutes earlier. But now he looked small beneath those lights, unsure of what had just struck him down. Chuck stopped beside him, standing tall in the soft glow from above. For a long moment he just stood there silent, his shadow stretching over the man who had tried to break him with words and pride. The crowd watched closely, leaning forward, holding their breath as if afraid even to whisper. Then, slowly, Chuck lowered himself down. He knelt beside Python, leaning close enough so only the two of them could hear what came next. No microphones, no cameras, no show. He spoke softly, his voice quiet, but steady, each word sinking deep into the space between them. You fought for pride, I fought for peace. Python blinked confused, the words slipping through the fog in his mind. Chuck's voice didn't rise. He didn't need to explain. He simply let the words settle low and clear. That's the difference between noise and purpose. Python's breathing slowed, his chest still heaving, but his eyes began to clear just a little. Chuck's gaze stayed firm but calm, filled with something deeper than pity or victory. One more sentence, soft as a whisper. When you learn why you fight, then you'll know how to stand. The words lingered there heavy and quiet, filling the space between them like a weight pressing gently on the heart. Chuck didn't wait for a reply. He gave a slight nod, just enough for Python to feel the meaning behind it. Then he rose slow and steady, leaving Python staring up at him in stunned silence. The crowd stayed hushed, sensing something had just passed between the two men, even if they hadn't heard it. Chuck turned away, his steps steady as he walked toward the cage door. Megan stood waiting nearby, her eyes filled with something between awe and relief, watching as her grandfather moved through the aftermath with quiet grace. Chuck didn't raise his hands. He didn't wave to the crowd. He simply walked out calm and sure, the door swinging open before him. As he passed through, the silence in the arena began to shift. It wasn't the same kind of quiet anymore. It wasn't shock or disbelief. It was respect. A deep, steady kind of respect that couldn't be shouted or forced. The kind that settled in slowly like old wisdom finally understood. Python still lay there staring at the spot where Chuck had knelt, his chest rising slower now. His face caught somewhere between confusion and clarity. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He just watched, lost in what had been whispered to him, feeling it settle deeper than any punch he had ever taken. The crowd remained on their feet, but there was no more cheering. Instead, there was a shared, quiet reverence, as if every person there had been handed a glimpse of something too rare to explain. Chuck disappeared into the shadows beyond the lights, his steps fading away, leaving nothing but the memory of that final, quiet exchange. And for the first time in that arena, it wasn't the roar of the crowd or the crash of fists that stayed behind. It was a whisper, soft, steady, unforgettable. The diner sat at the edge of the town, tucked beneath a flickering streetlight, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the quiet night. Inside it was warm and calm, with soft yellow bulbs glowing above worn leather booths and the steady hum of an old jukebox playing low in the corner. The world outside was still spinning from the fight, but In here everything felt slower, steadier, like time itself had decided to take a breath. Chuck sat near the window, his back to the wall as he always did, out of habit more than need. Megan sat beside him, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her eyes bright as she listened to the laughter and stories filling the air. Around the table were 4 other veterans men who carried their years with pride, their faces lined by sun, and time, their voices rough from age but full of life. They weren't talking about the fight. They were swapping old stories, leaning back in their seats, grinning like boys again, as they recalled days spent in muddy fields and dusty barracks. There was a comfort in the way they spoke, not just in the words, but in the rhythm, the quiet understanding between men who had seen the same storms. One of them, a tall man with the silver hair and a deep, gravelly voice, told a story about a night overseas when a stray dog wandered into their camp and wouldn't leave. They laughed about how they ended up sneaking scraps to it for weeks, pretending it was some top-secret mission to keep the officers from finding out. Megan couldn't stop smiling, caught between amusement and admiration, hearing these stories that rarely surfaced outside of circles like this. Another man chimed in, remembering a bar fight in some distant town where none of them spoke the language. He chuckled, shaking his head as he described the chaos, the broken chairs, and the way they all ended up walking away with nothing more than bruises and grins. Chuck listened quietly, his eyes soft, his smile small but steady, savoring the way these moments pulled them all together again. The waitress knew them by name, sliding plates of pie and fresh coffee onto the table without needing to ask. She moved with ease, smiling as she'd overheard bits of their stories, knowing these men had been through things most folks couldn't imagine. The diner itself seemed to lean in closer, its walls holding their laughter like it had done many nights before. Megan sipped her coffee, glancing at her grandfather, studying the quiet way he carried himself in these moments. He wasn't leading the conversation, wasn't taking center stage, but his presence seemed to anchor the table, giving the others space to speak freely, to remember out loud without worry. Outside, the night stretched wide and still, while inside they kept sharing memories, moving from laughter to softer tales that carried the weight of old battles. They spoke of friends who never made it home, of letters kept in drawers, of nights when the stars looked too far away. Their voices dipped low during those stories, not out of sadness, but out of respect. Megan watched closely, feeling the quiet pull of those words, hearing the lessons tucked inside them. Chuck finally spoke, his voice steady and calm. His words slow but sure. He told a story about a small town in the middle of nowhere, a place where he once helped rebuild a school after a storm. He didn't mention medals or fights, just the way the townspeople brought them bread every morning, their faces full of thanks. The men nodded, smiling softly, knowing the truth behind those kinds of stories. It wasn't the battles that stayed with you. It was the people. Megan sat quietly, her heart full, as she listened, realizing how much she had yet to understand about these men and their lives. Outside, the streets were empty, but inside, the world felt full. The only thing louder than the stories was the quiet sense of peace that settled over the table. The diner lights glowed against the windows, casting soft reflections of their faces, lined but warm, proud but gentle. Phones buzzed now and then on nearby tables as news of the fight kept spreading across screens, but nobody at their table looked down. The world could wait. For now, they were just old friends, sitting around a quiet table, sharing stories the way only they could. The bell above the diner door gave a soft chime, cutting gently through the low hum of voices and clinking coffee cups. Heads turned, and the room fell quiet as Python stepped inside. He wasn't swaggering now. His steps were slow, his shoulders drawn in, and there was no grin on his face. The fight had stripped him of the loud bravado he once carried like armor. His face still showed the marks from earlier, a faint bruise along his jaw and a cut near his eye. But it wasn't the bruises that stood out. It was the look in his eyes. He looked tired, not from the fight alone, but from something heavier. He spotted Chuck's table near the window where the old veterans sat with their coffee and pie, their conversation now silenced by his presence. Python stood at the edge of the booth, shifting awkwardly under the weight of their stares. Megan sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing just a bit, not out of anger, but from caution. She wasn't sure what brought him here. The veterans watched quietly, their faces unreadable, their years of discipline keeping their reactions measured. Chuck didn't move. He just looked up calm, as ever, his hands resting around his coffee cup. He didn't invite Python to sit, but he didn't send him away either. He simply waited. Python cleared his throat, his voice rough and quieter than anyone had ever heard it. He apologized. The words came slowly, like they had to be dragged out from someplace deep inside. He admitted his disrespect at the arena, his pride, and his foolishness. He apologized to Chuck first, then to Megan, and then to the whole table, knowing exactly what kind of men he was standing in front of. His voice shook once, just slightly, as he admitted he had let his mouth lead him into places his heart couldn't follow. The diner stayed still, the only sounds the low hum of the jukebox and the faint rattle of dishes behind the counter. Chuck listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't soften. He just let Python speak every word, not offering him a way out, not rescuing him from the weight of it. When Python finished, there was a long pause. Chuck's gaze stayed steady on him, his face calm but firm. Then, after a quiet breath, Chuck spoke, his voice as even as it had been in the cage. Words are easy. He let the words settle for a moment, never rushing. Anyone can stand here and say them. His eyes didn't leave Python's, holding him still with just that look. But what matters is what you do when no one's watching. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a hammer. The whole table sat still watching as Python absorbed them. Python's hands curled slightly at his sides, not in anger, but in something closer to regret. He nodded once, slow and heavy. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness right then. He simply accepted the words and let them settle deep. The veterans exchanged quiet glances. One gave a faint nod, almost approving, while another just watched his face softening ever so slightly. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of something else. Respect earned the hard way. Python turned to leave his head low, his steps quiet. As he reached the door, Chuck spoke again, his voice steady but carrying just enough for him to hear. Remember, actions echo longer than words. Python paused for a heartbeat, then walked out into the night, leaving the diner in its quiet glow. Inside, the world felt still again, but the air carried something new, a quiet understanding, a reminder that even in the darkest corners there was room for change. And, at that table by the window, the coffee stayed warm, the stories waiting to continue. The night had quieted again after Python left, but the table still carried the weight of the visit. Chuck sat with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring out the window at the empty street. The others kept their voices low, their conversations softer now, each man deep in his own thoughts. Megan watched her grandfather, sensing something still lingering behind his calm eyes. She could tell he wasn't done with Python yet. Chuck wasn't the kind to leave a door halfway closed. Finally, Chuck spoke, his voice steady but thoughtful. He mentioned a program one he and a few of the other veterans had started not long ago. It was quiet, low profile, meant only for those who truly needed it. A place where wounded veterans could train, regain strength, and learn to defend themselves again, not just physically, but inside too. One of the older men at the table, a broad-shouldered veteran named Sam, nodded along as Chuck spoke. His face softened with pride as he added that the program wasn't about fights or proving anything. It was about finding balance, about remembering what it felt like to stand steady again. Megan's eyes lit up as she listened. She had seen the program in action many times, watching men and women rebuild their spirits through sweat and quiet determination. She knew what it had done for people who thought their best days were long gone. Chuck's words carried weight as he leaned back, his gaze still fixed on the dark street outside. He said they were always looking for instructors. Not just anyone. The kind who had been humbled, who understood both sides of pride and failure. People who had learned the hard way how to fight for something bigger than themselves. The words hung there for a moment, and Megan knew exactly who he had in mind. Before anyone else could speak, the bell over the door chimed again. Python had returned. He stood just inside the door, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, his face tight with something between regret and uncertainty. His eyes flicked toward the table, but he didn't speak right away. Chuck didn't seem surprised. He simply motioned toward the empty seat at the end of the booth. Python approached slowly, each step heavier than the last, and lowered himself into the seat without a word. The room stayed quiet, the air thick with something too fragile to name. Chuck's voice broke the silence, calm and steady as ever. He explained the program again, this time looking directly at Python. He didn't pitch it like an offer. He didn't dress it up with promises. He simply laid it out. A place where people learn to rebuild from the ground up. A place where the noise of the world stayed outside. And then, just as calmly, he looked at Python and said that someone like him might have something real to offer. Python's face tensed, and for a long stretch of seconds he didn't speak. Megan watched him carefully, her heart tight as she saw the storm in his eyes. She could tell he wasn't sure what to feel. Part of him was defensive, still wrapped up in old pride, but another part, smaller but growing, looked lost. It was the part that had Chuck's words heard back in the cage. The part that didn't want to keep stumbling down the same dark road. Megan leaned in slightly, her voice soft but steady. She told him about the people in that program. They weren't looking for perfection or heroes. They were looking for someone who understood what it felt like to fall hard and stand back up. Her words weren't forceful. They weren't there to convince him. They were simply honest. Python's jaw tightened, his fingers curling slightly against the edge of the table. He admitted, in a voice rough with hesitation, that he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere like that. Chuck's reply was quiet but firm. None of us thought we belonged there at first. The truth in those words sank deep. The table stayed quiet as Python sat with it, staring down at his hands. He didn't agree right away. He didn't promise anything. But after a long pause, he looked up, meeting Chuck's eyes with something almost steady. He said he would think about it. His voice wasn't loud, but it was honest. That was enough. Chuck gave a small nod, his face calm and sure. The moment passed like a quiet breeze through the diner, leaving something soft in its place. Hope. Not loud or certain, but they're steady and waiting. Python stood, thanked them quietly, then left the diner once more, his steps lighter than before. The veterans watched him go, each one carrying the quiet weight of what they had just seen. Megan smiled softly, her heart lighter too, and as the night settled back in, the table returned to its quiet comfort, knowing something new had just begun. The diner had emptied out by the time Megan and Chuck stepped back outside. The night air was cool, with just enough of a breeze to remind them how late it had gotten. The streets were quiet, but the hum of the town still lingered in the distance, soft and steady. They walked side by side, neither one rushing the moment. The weight of the evening still hung between them, but in a gentler way now, more like a blanket than a burden. Chuck's steps were easy, his hands resting in the pockets of his jacket as if he had been waiting for this quiet all along. They stopped near an old bench under a streetlight, and without a word they sat down together. Megan glanced at him, her voice soft, but sure, asking the question that had been sitting in her chest all night. She asked why he had stepped into that cage. Why, after all these years, had he chosen that moment to stand up and fight again? Chuck didn't answer right away. He stared out at the empty street for a long moment, watching the way the shadows stretched across the pavement. His face stayed calm, but his eyes carried something heavier, something distant. Then he spoke his words slow and steady, like they were being pulled up from someplace deep. He told her it wasn't about pride or proving anything to anyone else. He said sometimes a man had to remind himself what he stood for, especially when the world started to forget. Megan listened closely, hearing the weight behind every word. She asked him gently why he kept so much of his past locked away, why he rarely shared the stories that shaped him. Chuck's gaze softened as he looked down at his hands, weathered but steady. He said there was a reason for that. And then, in the quiet of that still street, he began to tell her a story he had never shared before. It was from his early days in the military, back when he was just a young man full of fire and stubborn pride. He spoke of a mission gone wrong, a night where everything they planned fell apart in a matter of minutes. He described the chaos, the noise, the sudden shift from order to fear. But then his voice grew softer, steadier. He told her about the man who had saved his life that night. An older soldier, quiet and steady, who had pulled him from the wreckage without a word, risking everything to get him to safety. Chuck's voice caught just slightly as he spoke of that man's calm under fire, his refusal to leave anyone behind. He said the man never boasted about it, never asked for thanks. He simply told Chuck as they waited for rescue that the loudest men often fall first. That lesson had followed him every day since. Megan's eyes filled with quiet understanding as she listened. Chuck smiled faintly, a tired but warm kind of smile. He told her that was why he kept his stories quiet. Because some lessons aren't meant to be shouted, they're meant to be carried. Megan reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his, her voice soft with emotion. She said she understood now. Chuck gave her hand a gentle squeeze, his eyes holding a quiet pride. They sat there for a while longer, neither one needing to speak. The night wrapped around them like an old friend, calm and steady, as the lights flickered softly overhead. And in that quiet, Megan saw her grandfather, not just as the legend others spoke about, but as the man he truly was. A man who carried his strength in silence, passing it down, not through words, but through the steady way he moved through the world. They stayed there until the night began to soften into dawn, sharing the kind of peace that only comes from knowing exactly where you stand. Together. Morning light crept in through the thin curtains, soft and pale, casting a quiet glow across the small apartment. Python sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. He hadn't slept much, though his body ached for rest. The city outside was already waking up, cars passing in the distance, voices rising from sidewalks, but the noise felt far away. In this small space there was only stillness and the weight of his own thoughts. He sat, hunched forward, his elbows on the table, staring at the phone resting near his hand. It wasn't ringing, it wasn't buzzing, but it sat there like a question he wasn't ready to answer. He had made the call just before dawn. No cameras, no announcements, just a quiet call to the fight promoter, his voice low and steady, telling them he was pulling out of his next bout. There had been silence on the other end, then the confusion, then pushback. He had listened to every word, letting them rattle off reasons, threats, and disbelief. But in the end, he had said the same thing again. He wasn't stepping back in. Now, as the morning stretched on, he sat with the weight of that choice, knowing it wasn't just about walking away from a fight. It was about everything that had led him here. His reflection in the window stared back at him softer than the man he had been just a night ago. He thought about Chuck's words, the ones that had settled into his bones. Actions echo longer than words. Those words hadn't left him, not even for a moment. They had circled in his head quiet, but a constant making him see every choice he had made through a different lens. He thought about the crowd, the cheers he used to chase the noise he had always believed mattered most. But, sitting here now in the quiet, he realized none of that noise had followed him home. He was alone, and yet somehow it didn't feel as hollow as he had feared. He remembered the look in Megan's eyes, not pity, but something steadier, something that had challenged him without needing to say much. He thought about the veterans at that table, their quiet ease, the way they carried their history without needing to parade it. He had never known men like that before. Men who didn't have to roar to be heard. Men who didn't need to win every fight to walk tall. For the first time, he wondered what it would feel like to be that kind of man. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, letting the warmth soak into his skin. His body still ached from the fight, but somewhere beneath the soreness there was something else. Relief. Not from stepping out of a fight, but from stepping off the path he had been stuck on for too long. He wasn't sure what came next. He wasn't foolish enough to think everything had changed overnight, but he knew the first step had to be quiet. It had to start here, in this room, in this moment, before the world outside could see it. He reached for the notebook, sitting near the edge of the table, its pages mostly empty. For years it had sat untouched, just another prop for his image, something he kept around to look like a man who planned ahead. But today it felt different. He opened it slowly, the paper stiff from disuse. Then, without forcing it, he began to write. He didn't write about victories or headlines. He wrote about what mattered. He wrote about purpose, about regret, about the difference between pride and peace. He didn't know if anyone else would ever read the words, but for the first time that didn't seem to matter. He was writing for himself. The sun rose higher, casting a stronger light across the room. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware of the quiet shift taking place in this small kitchen. Python set down his pen and sat back, breathing a little easier. The road ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in a long while he wasn't afraid to walk it. Not for fame, not for noise, but for something quieter, something worth holding on to, and in that quiet, with nothing but the hum of the morning around him, he knew he had finally taken the first real step forward. Python stood just outside the gym, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his hoodie, staring at the door like it might push him back. The building wasn't flashy. It sat on a quiet street corner, tucked between a mechanic's shop and a row of small businesses, its windows covered with blinds, and its entrance marked only by a simple wooden sign that read, Veterans Training Center. It looked more like a neighborhood garage than a place where lives were quietly rebuilt. He took a breath and pushed the door open, stepping into a space that felt worlds apart from the arenas he knew. The air inside smelled like old leather and sweat, but not the sharp, frantic kind from fight nights. This was the scent of steady work, the kind that built strength over time. The room was wide and open, with worn mats covering the floor and heavy bags hanging from thick chains. No music blasted from speakers. No crowds watched from the sidelines. Just the quiet thud of fists meeting pads and the soft hum of determination filling the air. Veterans moved through their drills with quiet focus, some on crutches, some with prosthetic limbs, others with scars that went deeper than skin. Python's stomach tightened. He had walked into plenty of gyms before, but never one that made him feel this out of place. He stood there uncertain until a man approached him from across the room. Sam, the same broad-shouldered veteran from the diner, greeted him with a nod, his face lined but kind. He didn't offer a handshake right away. He simply asked if Python was ready to work. Python swallowed hard and nodded. Sam led him deeper into the gym, weaving through the small groups of men and women working together. There were no spotlights here, no cameras, only quiet, steady effort. Python's eyes caught on a young woman hitting pads with a precise controlled strikes her left leg replaced by a carbon fiber prosthetic. She moved with such focus that it stunned him. He watched another man older, with thick burn scars along his arms, coaching a younger vet through a set of grappling drills. There was no pity here, only patience. Sam explained softly that everyone in the room had fought their own battles inside and out. They weren't here for pity or praise. They were here to regain what had been lost: strength, peace, purpose. Python nodded, listening closely, but his chest felt tight. Sam pointed toward the far corner, where a group practiced slow-controlled defensive movements, learning how to break falls and roll safely. Python watched them, seeing every careful step and every patient repetition. He had spent years chasing speed and power. But here, everything was different. It wasn't about how fast you moved. It was about how steady you could become. Then he saw him. Chuck stood near the back wall, arms crossed, watching the room with quiet pride. He didn't speak. He didn't step in. He simply watched. Python felt the weight of that gaze, not as a challenge, but as something steadier, like a reminder to stay present. Sam guided Python toward the mats, showing him the basics of the session. They weren't asking him to lead. Not yet. They just asked him to listen, to observe, to be there. Python sat on the edge of the mat, watching carefully as the drills continued. At first, his mind kept drifting, but the more he watched, the more he felt drawn in. He saw how each person moved at their own pace, how no one rushed or judged. He saw laughter mixed with sweat-quiet jokes passed between breaths, and hands reaching out to help steady a stumble. It wasn't the kind of toughness he had chased for so long. This was different. It was quiet. It was patient. It was stronger. Hours passed without him noticing. He found himself leaning in, asking questions, offering to hold pads for a younger vet working on balance drills. His voice stayed low, unsure at first, but each exchange made it easier. The more he gave, the lighter he felt. In the far corner, Chuck still watched, his expression calm but steady. He wasn't here to push. He was here to witness. Python caught his gaze once, and in that brief glance, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't approval. It wasn't praise. It was something quieter, the beginning of trust. By the time the session ended, Python's hands ached from holding pads and steadying others. But he didn't want to leave. He sat quietly on the bench near the door, watching the others pack up his chest full of something he couldn't quite name. Sam sat beside him, his words easy and low. He told Python that showing up was the hardest part. Everything after that came one step at a time. Python nodded, feeling the truth settle in. He glanced towards Chuck again, seeing him now not as a fighter, not even as a legend, but as a man who had spent a lifetime passing down something that couldn't be taught in words. Respect, responsibility, purpose. And sitting there in the soft light of that quiet gym, Python realized the torch wasn't given with ceremony or noise. It was passed through the presence, through patience, and it had started to pass to him. The gym had mostly emptied by the time Megan found Python sitting alone near the far wall. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands hanging loose, staring at the floor with a look that was hard to pin down. He wasn't worn out from the drills, not exactly. It was something deeper than tired muscles. Megan walked over her steps light but steady, and sat down beside him without a word. They both stayed quiet for a moment, the soft hum of the overhead lights filling the space between them. She could see the shift in him, the way his shoulders had softened just slightly, the hard edges he usually carried now quiet. After a while, she broke the silence, her voice low and even. She told him that it had taken her a long time to understand her grandfather, too. She said that when she was younger, she couldn't figure out why he never talked about his past unless someone dragged it out of him. She thought maybe he just didn't care to share. Python listened closely, his eyes still on the floor, but his attention was fully there. Megan's voice stayed calm as she explained. Chuck had seen too much to waste words. She said he had been given every chance to chase the spotlight after his military days and his fighting career. People offered him fame money, everything that came with it, but he always turned it down. Not because he wasn't proud of what he had done, but because he believed some victories were meant to be carried quietly. Python's gaze lifted just slightly, his eyes tracing the space around them. Seeing the gym differently now. Megan kept going, her words soft but steady. She told him about the years Chuck had spent helping others in silence, showing up at hospitals, working with families, training veterans in the quiet corners of towns where no cameras followed. She said Chuck had always believed that humility was a stronger shield than pride. Python let those words settle, feeling the truth in them more deeply than he expected. He admitted in a rough but honest voice that he had never really understood that kind of quiet before. He had always thought the world rewarded the loud ones. Megan's smile was small but knowing. She said it usually did, but what lasted wasn't noise. It was the work done in silence. She looked at him, then her eyes steady but kind, and told him that what mattered wasn't how many people knew his name. It was what he left behind when nobody was looking. Python sat with that, his breath slow and steady, letting its weight sink in. He said he never imagined he'd want something different. But now, after what he'd seen, he wasn't sure he could go back to the way he had been before. Megan didn't push him. She simply said that change doesn't happen with big speeches or sudden decisions. It happens in small choices every day, in the way you show up, in how you treat others when there's nothing to gain. Python nodded slowly, the words settling into a part of him that had been waiting for them. He looked out across the empty mats, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. He said he wanted to learn how to carry something worth holding. Not for cameras, not for fame. Just for himself. Megan's smile grew warm and sure. She told him that was exactly how it started. He glanced toward the far door where Chuck had been standing earlier, now gone, but somehow still present in every corner of the room. Python could feel it now. The man's quiet had shaped everything here. He understood that last night's fight wasn't about fists or pride. It was about reminding him there was another way to live. He sat back against the wall, his body tired but his heart lighter. Megan rose to leave, her voice soft as she said one last thing. Her grandfather had always believed the loudest lessons were learned in silence. She told him he was already listening. Python stayed there after she left alone in the quiet, letting those words echo through the empty gym. And as he sat there, something shifted inside him. A small, steady flame started to burn. Not loud, not fast, but real. And in that quiet he knew he was ready to begin again. The night had settled deep by the time Chuck and Megan sat on the porch, the quiet wrapping around them like an old friend. The air was cool, carrying the soft scent of pine and distant rain, and the sky above stretched wide and clear, dotted with stars. They sat side by side in the old wooden chairs, the kind that creaked with every small movement, but felt like they belonged exactly where they were. Neither of them spoke at first. The world didn't feel like it needed words right away. The only sound was the soft rhythm of crickets and the wind moving through the trees beyond the porch. Megan took a slow sip from her cup, the warmth lingering between her hands before her voice broke the calm. She said she had been thinking about everything that had happened, all the noise, the fights, and the unexpected turns. She admitted she never expected the night to end the way it had, Not with quiet conversations and second chances, but with something steadier. Chuck's face stayed calm. His gaze set on the horizon where the last hint of moonlight touched the trees. Megan glanced at him, her voice soft but full of meaning. She told him she had always admired his strength not just in fights but in how he carried himself through the years. She said it wasn't just his skill that changed people, it was his calm, his patience, his way of standing firm without forcing anyone to listen. Chuck's eyes stayed steady, but a small quiet smile touched his face. He said it had taken him a long time to learn that words only went so far. He explained that when he was younger, he thought respect came from power from winning and proving himself. But over the years, he learned the real strength came from knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet. Megan listened closely, soaking in every word as the porch lights cast a soft glow between them. Chuck went on, his voice slow but sure. He said legacy wasn't built on noise. It wasn't about what people said after you were gone. It was about what stayed behind in the people you had reached. Megan's eyes softened as she looked at him, her heart full from the simple honesty in his words. He told her that sometimes the biggest change came not from shouting, but from standing still long enough for others to find their own way. Megan let those words settle in the air between them, quiet and steady, holding their weight in her chest. She said she had seen it with her own eyes now, how something small could shift everything. She saw it in Python in the gym, and in every person who had crossed Chuck's path that week. Chuck nodded, his gaze still distant, but his presence fully there beside her. He said it wasn't about turning every person around. Some would never listen. Some weren't ready yet. But it was enough to leave the door open to offer a quiet example and let others walk through when they were ready. Megan smiled softly, feeling a deep sense of peace rise within her. She said that was the kind of strength she wanted to carry, too. Chuck glanced at her, then his eyes full of something warm and proud. He told her she already carried it more than she realized. They sat there for a while longer, watching, as the night deepened, the stars brightening overhead. No more words were needed. The air felt full enough with everything they had shared, and everything they both understood without saying it. Megan reached for his hand, her fingers resting gently over his. Chuck gave her hand a small squeeze, the kind that didn't need to be explained. The porch light flickered once in the distance, and the wind stirred again, soft and cool, wrapping around them like a promise. In that quiet moment, under the steady watch of the night sky, they sat together in peace. No noise, no crowds, just two souls bound by trust, sharing the kind of silence that carried more than words ever could. And as the night held them close, it was clear that some legacies were meant to be quiet, built slowly, carried gently, and passed down one heart at a time.